One of the really great parts about being the MC at an event like this is that you get to meet a lot of really cool people. And so I am really honored and privileged to be able to introduce our next speaker, our keynote speaker, Alex Schadenberg, who is the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. I have his bio, and like all bios, it lists a lot of stuff. He's written a couple of books, he's been a speaker all over the world, and so on. That's nice. But I did have a chance to talk to him beforehand. And what I found out is that he has 6 kids and almost 4 grandchildren. The 4th one will be born in August? Late August, early September, so it's coming up. He's been involved in right-to-life issues his entire life. His parents were involved in right-to-life. And I said, well, your bio says that you've spoken all over the world. Can you tell me about a few? Well, he was a speaker at the Michigan Right to Life Conference and the National Right to Life Conference. And then he started going through this huge laundry list of countries where he spoke in Germany, Israel, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, oh my gosh, I can't remember all this stuff. And so I think it might be easier to just introduce our next speaker, Alex Schadenberg.
So we said I almost have 4 grandchildren. Well, we have a 4th grandchild. I just can't hold that child yet. My daughter holds her all the time. And my daughter Genevieve just got married a little over a week ago. We just got back from our honeymoon. So I've got 4 married children. So that's good news, really good news. But he didn't tell you the full story. He asked me, well, what was the WOW event that I spoke at? And of course, I'm in Michigan, so I said it was the Michigan Right to Life Conference. Anyway, so I'm going to talk to you about assisted suicide, and you know that you have a bill in your legislature, Bill 681, which is to legalize assisted suicide. I'm not sure if they're going to be taking it up. I get the feeling they might still be pushing this bill. The fact of it is that there is a big push for assisted suicide across America, as you'll hear in my presentation. Don't hold it against me, I am a Canadian. I'm not going to talk about hockey because obviously I'd probably be a Leafs fan, sorry to say. But nonetheless, we have euthanasia in Canada. So we've gone all out for killing, and it's actually become very ridiculous in my own country. And so when I'm giving a talk about these things in other places, throughout the US, throughout Canada, throughout anywhere in the world, I'm always saying, you know, use Canada as the example of where these things go, because it's gone ridiculous in our country. And the fact of it is if you open the door, that's the end. That's the end game. That's where it goes. I have to say something else to you before I get started. Someone said to me they heard my recent presentation in another town nearby, and they said, oh, well, there's a lot of information. I want you to remember one thing, that's all. When you leave, you can say, I got that message. I'm opposed to killing people. So all the rest of it's just information, good information, just to know. And sometimes we make these arguments too difficult, and we get too much into the grass, you know what I'm saying? And we should just keep it clear. I'm opposed to killing people because, you know, you can't come back and say, well, what about the person suffering from cancer? Well, I'm concerned about the person who has cancer and might be going through pain. I agree with that. Yeah, I'm concerned about that person, but I'm opposed to killing people. So in the US, you have 10 states that have legalized assisted suicide. So obviously, Michigan, there's a lot to be concerned because you're obviously one of the states that have not legalized, and you have a governor who wants it legalized. She wants that on her agenda as to what to do. In the past 2 years, though, there's been, like this year alone, there's been 20 states with assisted suicide bills, and at this point, none of them have passed. Now, it doesn't mean, I'm really hoping that's going to be the end result, but in the last 2 years, no assisted suicide new bill has passed in America. So we've been able to hold it off, and I think that's a big success, considering how much money the death lobby has put into several U.S. states to try and get it passed. When I say there's been 20 bills, there's also been several states that have got bills to expand their assisted suicide laws. I'm going to go into that with you in a second. But and here's the important point, nearly every state that's legalized assisted suicide has now expanded their law. Now, why am I saying that? Because I was asked to say something about your Michigan bill, and there's two different types of bills to legalize assisted suicide in America. There's the one type of bill which is quite expansive, where the assisted suicide lobby thinks that in that state they can get a bill which is going to allow for a wider agenda from the beginning. And then there's other states like Michigan where the bill's actually written as an Oregon-type clone, right? So it's intentionally written for what purpose? They want to get it legalized, and then they're going to try and expand it later. So you see that there's two different scenarios, and there's quite a few states that have what you call these Oregon-type clones. So they say, look, this bill has got all these safeguards, etc., etc. Let's be very clear. The only reason they're presenting such a bill is they don't think they can get an expansive bill through now. So therefore they're going to go for a bill that looks a bit tighter in order to convince people that, oh, we can have a little bit of killing and that'll be okay. That's not their intention. It's only their intention to legalize. You have to remember that. That's going to be their goal. That's their goal in Michigan. They want to legalize it and then expand it later because their goal is to legalize. The other thing is, just so you put this in your mind and you can understand these things when I say it, the biggest hill to get over is legalization. That's the hardest thing. Once it's legal, you've already changed the goalpost. And then it's easier to expand it later because then it doesn't seem reasonable not to expand it later. And I will get into that in a second. So what's the assisted suicide lobby doing? Well, they're trying to legalize assisted suicide in more states. That's one thing. We already know that. They've got 20 bills this year in 20 different states. They're trying to expand these laws where they've already legalized it. So most of the original bills had a 15-day waiting period. You'll notice that almost all those states have removed that 15-day waiting period. So at first they said, well, we're going to have this waiting period, and then they want to get rid of it later. They're also expanding these laws by adding more people who can do it. So quite a few states have now added nurses. They've added physician assistants now who can do it in their laws. And the reason for that is there's too few doctors willing to kill. Therefore, if you add to the list of who can do the killing, you're obviously going to get more killers, right? And they're trying to eliminate the residency requirements. So I'll get into this in a second, but I can just tell you quickly, Oregon and Vermont have eliminated the residency requirements. Now, why is that important? Sadly, it means that anybody in Michigan can now die by assisted suicide in either Vermont or Oregon. That's what it means. By getting rid of the residency requirement, anybody in America can die right now in those two states. They're also trying to allow death by lethal injection or lethal drugs, but that would be euthanasia. So before I go too far, I should quickly explain to the differences. Canada, all the deaths essentially are euthanasia. So what is that? We legalized euthanasia in Canada in the same way as the Netherlands. We created an exception to homicide in our criminal code. It's murder, right? The doctor in euthanasia kills you. With assisted suicide, the doctor would then prescribe you the lethal poison, but you take it yourself. So you can see the difference is not the intention. The intention is to cause death. The difference is not the outcome. Death is the outcome. The difference is who does the act. In euthanasia, the doctor or nurse would do the act. In assisted suicide, they prescribe you the lethal poison, and you have to do it yourself. Now, you can see how obviously that euthanasia is the same thing, but even more sinister. They're trying to launch court cases. They've had quite a few little court cases that they've launched to try and create a right to assisted suicide, because that's their end goal, the right to assisted suicide. They have not accomplished that. That's very good. They've been passing in different states assisted suicide by telehealth. So what does that mean? That means someone can be approved in Hawaii and Vermont. They can be approved for assisted suicide over a Zoom meeting. So they get approved to die over a Zoom meeting. Now think about this. They're doing assisted suicide by telehealth in Oregon, even though it's not in the law. They're doing it anyway because basically there's a blind eye turn to that, right? So imagine somebody in Michigan contacting an assisted suicide doctor. I'll get into that in a second. Contacting an assisted suicide doctor in Oregon, getting approved by telehealth. Then all they'd have to do is fly there to die. Think about that. That's what they're pushing. They're trying to also have the drugs shipped to you so that you don't have to pick it up. They would just ship them to you. Just think about during COVID when people were having packages stolen off their front porches. They're trying to change what the definition of assisted suicide, not by its words, but by its meaning. So they're changing what it means. So therefore, by changing it from terminal illness, if you change the definition, suddenly it becomes available for chronic conditions. Now, what's important about that? Well, obviously speaking, if you don't have to be terminally ill, if you change how the words are interpreted, then suddenly people with disabilities become the people who are all dying or are specifically focused on for assisted suicide. And they're also trying to set up these regional assisted suicide clinics. None of this should be too confusing to you considering what we do with abortion, right? So in 2022, California assisted suicide report. Now why am I going to go through this? I'm going to go through this very quickly with you because you get the idea of what I'm talking about. What you had in California is you had a 63% increase in assisted suicide in 2022. Massive. What's important about that also is that when you look at the data, it says that there were 833 assisted suicide deaths. No, 853. I've got the screen and almost put on my glasses, right? And then, but it also said there was 294 deaths where the people had received the lethal poison. And I think we should call it poison. I think poison is a better word. There's 294 people who received the lethal poison who did die in California, but they have no idea what they died of. Think about that. These are supposed to be laws that are supposedly safe with oversight, and yet you have, so you had in California 1,270 prescriptions written, you had 853 deaths, and you had 294 deaths, as I say, the government has it right in the report, 294 deaths where the ingestion status was unknown. So they know they died, they know they were prescribed, and they picked up the poison, they just don't know what happened to them. Think about that. Just think about it. Where else could you? The other thing about it, who dies by assisted suicide? I know we like to talk about the vulnerable. Now I'm going to get into that a little bit in Canada, because it's been quite serious in Canada, the people with disabilities who are dying by euthanasia. Nonetheless, when you look at the California data, you see that it is the white, the worried, and the wealthy who are dying by assisted suicide. Now why is that important? Because we're actually fighting a movement that is actually not the normal sort of person. If you look at the data, you see that the average person in California is not actually interested in assisted suicide at all. The majority, the higher population in California are Hispanics, and if you look at the numbers dying by assisted suicide who are Hispanic, it's very small. I'm just saying that to you because you're looking at this sort of, how would you say, this yuppie sort of crowd who want people to be able to be involved with killing them. I think it's important when we're putting our message together that we're thinking of who's going to die by this, because we have to be sort of accurate. The death lobby also will tell you that there's no slippery slope. There's no slippery slope. They're going to say to you, oh, well, you know, this is a law we're presenting. Well, let's look at the recent California bill. Now, I have good news for you. That California bill was just pulled, SB 1196. But, to put this into perspective, this is what they were proposing to change the law. They were proposing to allow it to be done by IV, intravenous, rather than the lethal drug that you would take yourself. If you do it by intravenous, what they were actually saying is they wanted to legalize euthanasia. That's what they were actually saying. Because it's, even if you consider a contraption where you push a button, it's completely indistinguishable from euthanasia when someone's going to have to put the lethal poison into the intravenous. Someone has to do that. So they were talking about expanding the law. They were talking about getting rid of the 6-month prognosis, and they wanted it to be grievous and irremediable medical condition, which is the Canadian situation. What does it mean to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition? There's many people in this room who actually have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. Let's be brutally honest. It means that you have a condition which is not going to get better, even though it might not cause your death anytime soon. And most people with disabilities, they have a disability. Why? Because they have an irremediable medical condition, right? That's just the reality. And when I say to you, I'm not even joking. Many people in this room would have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. It doesn't mean you're dying, but that would be the reason for causing your death. They also wanted to allow early stage dementia. Now think about this. What are they saying? Think about this. They're saying that people who are incompetent or have questionable competency should be able to die by assisted suicide. That's what they're saying. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about pushing it. Now, they also want to remove the California residency requirement. Well, you know, California is a nice place to go, but do you want to die there? I don't know. I really don't know. What I'm saying to you is this bill was removed. Now, I have to be brutally honest. A lot of people are saying, why was this bill withdrawn? It was actually because the assisted suicide lobby decided it was too much too quick. They were afraid that if California passed SB 1196, that Michigan will never pass 681. Because they would say, wait a second, you know, that's what you did in California. That would be then the next step in Michigan. Remember, before you legalize, you can argue something, but once you've legalized, everything shifts, right? Everything shifts. Okay, so Oregon. I'm actually going to jump the Oregon data. It's not too important. In Oregon, you had a court case challenging the residency requirement in Oregon. So this was a case of Dr. Gideon, who was an assisted suicide doctor, and Compassionate Choices, which is the assisted suicide lobby. They decided to challenge the residency requirement in Oregon. They said that it was unconstitutional because it denied equality to health care. They said you cannot deny health care to people who are out of state. So they were immediately assuming that killing someone by assisted suicide is health care. Right? Now the problem is that the government of Oregon never actually tried to defend their law. What they did is they succumbed to the case and they made an agreement to remove their residency requirement. So in fact, they accepted the argument that this is some sort of health care. If you're talking about, you know, actual medical treatment, it would actually make sense because let's say they were some sort of specialist in Oregon. It would be normal that people out of state would go to that specialist. So obviously speaking, you can't deny health care to people who are out of state, but this is not health care. But by doing that, obviously, the assisted suicide lobby achieved that first big push because they want to legalize this nationally, and they know they're never going to pass this in Mississippi. They know they're never going to pass this in Texas. So obviously speaking, where it's legal, if they can remove the residency requirements, they can set up assisted suicide clinics. Dr. Gideon has now set up an assisted suicide clinic. I hate to tell you that, but it is true. Colorado has a bill to remove the residency requirement. Oregon and Vermont have now both removed their residency requirement. Compassionate Choices has got a court case right now in New Jersey to remove their residency requirement. So you can see where they're pushing and you can see where they're going. What it means that every American can die by assisted suicide in these states. Now let's talk about what they've done with definitions. So first of all, some people would say, oh, this, Alex, you know, you're just pushing the envelope. This is about people who are dying and suffering. You know, we're really only less than their life by maybe a few weeks. That's the sort of thing they're going to argue, right? They're going to say, you know, and if you don't want that, that's your business, but don't force that on me. I don't want to suffer, they might argue. But in fact, it's not about that at all. You see this in March 2022, the article in the Colorado Sun about the doctor in Colorado who was doing assisted suicide on people with anorexia. So what this case was is that this doctor had redefined anorexia as a terminal condition because in Colorado they still have in their law the 6-month prognosis issue. Now the problem with anorexia is it is something that is very difficult for people to actually overcome, but it is not considered a terminal condition. If you look at the data on anorexia, most people who have been part of any study related to anorexia do not actually die by anorexia. Very few people actually die by anorexia if you look at the data. Not saying no one does, but it's not considered a terminal condition. But by redefining it as a terminal condition, this doctor was then involved with assisted suicide of people with anorexia. So you understand that changing of how you interpret something changes things completely. In Oregon, there have been assisted suicides for people with anorexia. I just published an article today by an ethicist in the UK because there's a bill in Scotland to legalize assisted suicide, and he's arguing that based on the language of the Scottish bill, you could have assisted suicide of people with anorexia at the age of 16, because it's a 16 age bracket in Scotland. The assisted suicide lobby, also this whole thing with the lethal drug cocktails. You see, the big issue here is everyone has been told this is all about these deaths with dignity. So they define this as somebody who's, they say, well, you're suffering and nearing death. We're going to give you a peaceful death. That's what they're selling, this peaceful death. Well, let's be brutally honest. Nobody in this room wants to suffer. I'm not saying you're not willing to accept your suffering. We don't want to suffer, okay? We're all human beings. Let's be brutally honest. We don't want to suffer. You're already suffering listening to me. That's probably enough, right? Nonetheless, the Assisted Suicide Lobby, they decided that they would be, they needed to find a cheaper way to do assisted suicide. So the Assisted Suicide Lobby started developing these new lethal poison cocktails. And so you see this report coming out of the Seattle Times in March of 2017, reporting on this, where they said the first second alternative turned out to be too harsh, burning patients' throats as they were approaching death. Now this would be, you would think, a sort of a crazy idea that people are screaming in pain when they're having their death with dignity. But this was the reality. Then the second group of drugs that they came up with, they said, well, we're going to have to make them less harsh. So they changed the combination, and they came up with this new drug system, but then they had these long, drawn-out deaths. And it says in the article, up to 31 hours. Well, last year, there was a death that was, now I don't have it on, it was like 115 hours or something like that last year in Oregon, one of the deaths. It was the longest death ever by assisted suicide. But you see what they did. They were trying to find a new lethal drug or lethal poison cocktail that was going to be inexpensive but effective at killing people. But we have to think about this further, about what they were doing. They were doing lethal drug experiments on humans. Think about that. First of all, there's no system that would approve such an experiment. People who were approved for assisted suicide, that's one issue, and of course I'm opposed to killing people, so I'm not in favor of any of that. But you go a step further, did those people actually agree to be part of a lethal drug trial? Think about that. That shows you, but then again, why am I worried about it? If they're ethically willing to kill people, why wouldn't they do that? An article published in The Atlantic in January 2019 stated, now this is an article where they're interviewing this Robert Wood, who is the medical director of the group in Washington State that does assisted suicide. I don't know why an assisted suicide group needs a medical director. I'm not sure. It doesn't quite make sense to me why they need a medical director. But anyway, he said about the drugs, well, he was basically saying, well, we knew this was going to kill them. Makes me feel a lot better already. We know this is going to kill them, but they weren't sure quite about the outcome. And then they explained about the chloral hydrate causing burning of people's throats and things like that. And they did this to about, it says 70, it was actually 67 people died this way. And yet they're talking about deaths with dignity. And they're thinking that we should be taking this seriously. This is about killing people, let's be brutally honest. This is about killing people. This is about trying to find a cheap and effective way of killing people. This is what they're about. Medical Express reported in September of 2020, a little known secret not published by advocates of aiding dying is that, many of these deaths might be speedy, some is very, very slow. It mentions here that some have lasted 3 days, and I mentioned, the most recent stats out of Oregon show that the one was about 5 days. Imagine dying over 5 days with these lethal drugs. It's actually pretty sad if you think about what they're willing to do to kill somebody with. It's pretty insane. But I always say to people, you think this is a death of dignity. Well, let's talk about what they're actually doing. Let's talk about what they're actually doing. Same idea when we're talking about abortion. What are you actually doing here? What is the act all about? And I think that's fundamentally important. Many people support assisted suicide. Why? Because they fear dying a bad death. But that's a normal human response, isn't it? That's a normal reality. All of us might fear dying a bad death, but they're selling that. So the difficulty with the assisted suicide issue, like other issues, is the other side's argument is simple, and they just keep banging on it, which is they will come forward with a story of somebody with a difficult health condition, and they will just keep presenting that as this person is suffering. Well, really, shouldn't we be caring for that person? Is killing then the answer? That's what they're selling. But what they're doing is they're playing on our fear. It's all about fear, working our fear. Let's talk about Canada for a second. Canada last year had about 16,000 euthanasia deaths. That's my approximation. I've been going through a lot of the data, and that means we're the highest in the world now. Now, why is that sadly important? Well, we legalized in 2016. It's now 2024, and I was referring to the 2023 data. The Netherlands legalized in 2002. So they've had normalization well over 20 years, and yet we now surpass them in Canada. It's a very sad story. Quebec has the highest rate in the world at 7.3% of all deaths. Now let's put this in perspective. You say 7.3% of all deaths. That's quite sad, Alex. It's actually much worse than that. Quite a few people die of things like car accidents or whatever. They might die instantly of a heart attack or things like that. So obviously then, euthanasia was never an option for them. So if you're actually looking at the data related to people who this could be actually an option for them, the numbers are very high. It's very high. It's very, very, very disturbing if you think about what's going on. And we've had now euthanasia for reasons of soldiers with PTSD, poverty, homelessness, difficulties getting medical treatment. I'm going to go into that in 1 second. So what happens is we legalized in 2016 in Canada, and I told you what they do is they want to legalize and then expand it later. It didn't take Canada very long. In March of 2021, we passed a bill to expand the law, so we removed the terminal illness requirement from the law. And what remained in the law at that point then was that they removed the terminal illness, so therefore you have to have an irremediable medical condition. Well, that's exactly what they're talking about in California, right? Changing it from a terminal illness requirement to an irremediable medical condition. Now, who falls into that? Well, there's a huge group of people who fall into that. Remember, a huge group. But on top of it, we also at that same time legalized euthanasia for mental illness alone. And that seems crazy. So if you follow the Canadian news at all, you would notice that this has been a big battle in Canada. Some of you do probably notice that because you're not too far from Canada. You might have seen, or maybe you're just avoiding Canadian news. It can be pretty sad. Yes, my Prime Minister has nice hair, but he's crazy. Yeah. Anyway, the fact of it is we legalized euthanasia for mental illness alone, but then they put a 2-year moratorium on that. So that would have meant that in March of 2023 we would have that in place. And then they put another year moratorium on that, so that means March of 2024. And now they've just passed legislation to make it March of 2027. Now, why are they backing that off? Well, because, killing people for mental illness alone is sort of a difficult thing to do, But the fact is they're actually sadly doing it already. But by removing the issue of terminal illness, what happened then to have an irremediable medical condition? What it meant is we started having these deaths for other reasons. So you start seeing these stories show up in the media, and I think you guys should use these stories because that is the end result of this. People who are living in poverty. Now what am I saying? Were they approved for euthanasia, for being killed based on poverty? The answer is no. They were approved based on having an irremediable medical condition. So these are people with disabilities, right? And because they are on a disability pension or a disability benefit, a lot of them were living in poverty, abject poverty. And they were, especially if you consider how much it costs to live in a place like Toronto. Like, give me a break. It's not possible to live in a place like Toronto and be on a disability benefit. It's just not possible. It's not possible. My own son, Peter, is autistic, and he's fortunate because he lives with his brother Thomas, my youngest son Thomas, and Peter, they live together. Because if they did not, there's no place that he could afford to live other than at home. But we live in this little town of Glencoe, and Peter says, why would I live in Glencoe? There's nothing there. Well, guess what? He's right. There's nothing there. So he wants to live in London, because at least it's a city. There's like 400,000 people. There's places to go, places to walk. But if you imagine being on a disability benefit and living in a city, it's almost impossible. And so these people are, we've had these stories of people dying by euthanasia. Why? Because of this. People who are homeless. We've had stories of people who are homeless dying by euthanasia. Why? Well, they were approved based on their irremediable medical condition. They just said, I can't handle being homeless any longer. I was selling a book. I don't have it with me today. I've sold them all. But this guy in Aurelia is sort of a nice town, actually. But anyway, he was a homeless guy in Aurelia who was seeking euthanasia. And he had been homeless for a long time. So one of our supporters, his name is Tim, he took in Tyler. Tyler was the guy who was homeless. He took Tyler in. So by taking Tyler in, Tyler went from wanting to die by lethal drugs to happy to be alive. And Tyler wrote a book about that. So we were involved with Tyler and we sold a lot of his books, etc. But like a lot of people who are homeless, Tyler has difficulties with addiction. So that's the difficulty. But let's move on with my talk. And the other thing is medical treatment questions. I don't have it here. We've had so many people who are, it's also because we have universal health care, so many people who end up in the medical queue. They're waiting for medical treatment, who are dying by euthanasia. It's ridiculous, the number of these stories that we're getting. But you know, the point of it is that you can see how that works. What do we do about this issue? I say we call it what it is. The other side wants you to think of nice terms like medical aid in dying. They want, assisted death. They want you to think of this in nice terms, same as like they don't want to use the word, they want to talk about how would you say, what are the words they use for abortion today? They try and redefine everything so it's all beautiful and nice. We can't be there. We have to call it what it is. What is this in euthanasia? Euthanasia is creating an exception to homicide. It's murder. That's what it is. So what are you doing when you legalize that? It's the same with assisted suicide. What does Bill 681 actually do? It gives doctors the right of law to be involved with killing you. That's what it does. They would say yes, but you get to ask. But if you actually read the legislation, the only place you're actually involved is your request. The rest is all the rules that the doctor must follow in order to be involved with killing you. And this is not what people think at all. They say it's all about my body, my choice. You've never heard that before, right? They say it's about my body, my choice, but this is a lie. It's the big lie. You know how you hear things over and over and over again and you see it as the truth because you just kept on hearing it over and again? That's the big lie. That's what we have happening in our culture today with assisted suicide. Assisted suicide is not an autonomous act. It requires a doctor or maybe a nurse practitioner. In Canada, nurse practitioners and doctors, right, can be involved. They're directly involved with causing your death. When was it an autonomous act when a doctor agreed that your life was not worth living and prescribed you lethal poison? Many of these people requesting assisted suicide, they have capacity issues, they're going through difficult times, but the bigger question is, why do people actually ask for assisted suicide? And I'm so pleased that I followed the beautiful woman talking about pregnancy counseling women at the door of the death center. Because what does she say? These women are hopeless. They feel their life is in a difficult place. They feel a lack of hope, a lack of meaning, and you're there to help them. It's the same thing with assisted suicide. And I've talked to a lot of people who have been approved for euthanasia because we do have a helpline. And I've spent a lot of time talking to people who've been approved or seeking approval. And it's universally the case that they're always in a situation where they're either depressed or they're feeling that their life lacks meaning, purpose, value, they've lost hope. And this is somehow about their freedom. This is about their autonomy. No, this is about cultural abandonment. That's what this is about. It's about a cultural abandonment. This also threatens my life. Why does it threaten my life? Everybody in this room will be thinking, oh, well, yeah, that's a bad thing, and there's lots of people going through difficult times, we should help them. It affects you personally because you're a human being. We all go through difficult times of our life. We all go through times where we have existential questioning to different degrees. Some people actually have a serious problem where they become depressed far easier than others, but we all go through those times. And what happens then is when you're questioning, when you're going through a difficult time, now assisted suicide, if it becomes an option, it becomes the end goal. Now, why am I saying this? We have several priests in the crowd. I'm sure you've heard this before, where you're visiting somebody and they say, Father, I don't know why I'm here. Are they saying, Father, kill me? No. Are they going through questioning? Are they going through a real human reality? Are they seeking some support? Yes, absolutely. But if assisted suicide is legal and they say that to a doctor, that becomes the request, the first request. Think about it. You end up on the death train. We need to be there for others. Suffering alone is also a reality in our culture. We know that there's more loneliness than ever before. We know that's a fact. Sadly, it's a fact. People in this room, we have family life. I have 6 kids. I have 3 grandkids I can hold and 1 coming soon. I have all this in my life. I have a beautiful wife. Obviously speaking, I have a lot of interconnectedness, which is what it means to be human. There's a lot of people who don't have that. And they might have had that at one point in their life, but guess what? They had 3 children. One's living in Los Angeles or something. One's living in Florida, and who knows where the 3rd one's living. And they're alone, and they're lonely, and they're going through difficult times in their life. They sometimes lose hope, right? They sometimes lose hope. The culture of abandonment associated with assisted suicide, it can be changed by a caring culture. We're pro-life people. We believe in a caring culture. That's what we're about. That's why you're walking in front of the Planned Parenthood clinic. Why? Yes, you want to save that baby's life, but you know you can only do so by caring for the woman who is carrying that child. You know that. You know that. You love her, and you should love her, and by loving her, her baby will have life. We know that this is true. It's essential that people who lack this feeling of hope are finding hope by a culture that cares for them. So anyway, my point comes down to this very thing. Why do people ask for assisted suicide? And it's not about suffering. Sometimes it is, but that's the minority. If you look at the Oregon data, you can have someone go through all the data with you, and I could have spent time just talking about data with you, and I would prove to you, yes, people don't ask for assisted suicide in Oregon for the reason of suffering. That's like a lower number, right? Why are they asking for it? Because these people are going through a difficult time in their life. They're feeling that their life lacks meaning, purpose, or value. They're wanting a way out. This is not about their autonomy. This is not about their freedom. This is about a cultural abandonment. These are deaths of despair. This is what it's about. I'm not going to talk about that. There's my end here. So what's the whole point? So your Bill 681, someone's going to say to you, oh, well, you know, it looks okay. You know, it's only going to allow assisted suicide for people who are terminally ill. It says right there a 6-month definition. It says you have to be suffering, etc. Okay, let me say one thing about suffering. We've had a case in Calgary right now. Some of you might have seen it. It's been published all over the place. A 27-year-old girl who's autistic has been approved for euthanasia, and her dad is taken into court. He can't understand how this doctor could have approved his daughter's death. She's not dead yet, okay? She's still alive. Because there's nothing wrong with his daughter. But because she knew to be approved for euthanasia in Canada, she had to say she was suffering. She went to the doctor for approval, and she went to a euthanasia doctor, so that's the first thing, a pro-death doctor. She went to the doctor for approval and told him she was suffering uncontrolled pain. Well, there's no way to prove she isn't. Right? How do I prove that you're not suffering uncontrolled pain? I can't prove that because it's completely subjective. So when the bill says you have to be suffering, I don't know. You know, they're saying that for what reason? It's to wave the flag of we're dealing with suffering people, right? They're trying to pass this bill. It's totally subjective. And you have to understand, this is very sad. I think that these things happen in a way, on purpose in a sense. Like in Canada, we're fighting this case of this autistic girl. Now I remember I have an autistic son. He's around the same age. So it really hits home to me. And she has been approved to be killed because she says she's suffering. You might have seen that Dutch story, the 28-year-old girl who also is autistic and says that she has deep depression and therefore she's been approved for euthanasia. Well, I don't know, guys. Why do we kill people? We should never be killing anybody. I'm opposed to killing people, but you can see where it goes. And it's not even to me where it goes. It's once you open the door, how can you close the door once it's open? But the other thing is, once you open the door, there is only one line in the sand. The line in the sand says I can either kill you or not kill you. Once I can kill you, the only debate we have after that is who does the killing and for what reason? Right? Because That's the line in the sand, right? And that's what we know. We know that's the reality. Whether that's assisted suicide or abortion, your governor is very pro-death, and she doesn't want there to be any line in the sand, but there was only one line in the sand. I can either kill you or not kill you. Right? That's the reality. Okay, so I'm done my talk. You guys have heard me long enough. And I'm not the only thing here tonight, but I do have a video out there you might be interested in. It's only $10. It's called Fatal Flaws. I got a few with me. This brand new book just came out. I mean, it just came out. So much so I haven't even done a review of it yet, but I read it through and it's quite amazing. It's by a doctor called Ewan Gallagher. He's a Christian doctor in Toronto. He's very, very impressive. So as soon as I saw the email, came over from him actually saying my book's just been published, I ordered 100 immediately. He's a fabulous guy. I know him quite well. And yes, it's $20 if you're interested. But he's a good Christian doctor, and it's called How Should We Then Die? I think it's very important. And then I've got this book about 20 years worth of articles, and it deals with the best articles, I believe, on euthanasia and assisted suicide. And I think I've spoken enough. I was told there'd be a little timer here. I don't see it, but that's fine. Yeah, but it's only telling me it's 8:24. But anyway, I think I've seen enough. And God bless you. If you want to talk about, I also take this week.